Lena Voss had learned, early in life, that silence was the safest thing a person could carry. She was 23 years old, small in the way that people described as delicate when they were being kind, and forgettable when they were not. Her hair was dark brown and always tied back, because loose hair was something she could not afford to think about. Her eyes were the color of river stones, gray, quiet, always watching. She worked the outer grounds of the Dre Kingdom pack every day without complaint, and every evening she returned to her small room at the edge of the territory, cooked whatever she had, and pressed her fingers around the old copper pendant at her throat until she could sleep. The pendant was the only thing her mother had left her. She never took it off. Sonly. The rejection happened on a Tuesday morning in early spring, in the great stone hall where all official pack decisions were announced. The hall could hold 400 wolves. That morning, it held 382, and every single one of them had come to watch. Lena stood in the center of the hall in her work clothes, gray trousers, brown boots, a plain shirt, because no one had told her to change. She had been summoned by a letter slipped under her door at 5 in the morning. The letter said only, "Report to the Great Hall at 9. She had not known what for. She knew now. Alpha King Calum Dre stood on the raised platform at the front of the hall and looked at her the way a person looks at something left on a doorstep that they did not ask for. He was tall, dark-haired, built like something designed to take up space. His eyes were pale gold, the eyes of a king, people said, as if eyes could hold titles. He held a sheet of formal pack law in one hand, and he did not need to read from it, because he had clearly memorized exactly what he wanted to say. He said it clearly, without hesitation, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. I, Calum Dre, Alpha King of the Dre Kingdom, formally reject the mate bond identified between myself and Lena Voss of the Outer Grounds. The bond is null. The connection is severed. I will not take a worthless Omega as my mate, and I will not insult this pack by pretending otherwise. 382 people heard the word worthless. Lena's right hand moved to the pendant at her throat. Her fingers closed around it. It was warm, warmer than it should have been, given that the hall was cold. She noticed this. She filed it away. She did not cry. She did not speak. She turned and walked out of the hall, and the crowd parted ahead of her the way water parts around a stone, and the sound of her boots on the stone floor was the only sound anyone could hear. She did not look back. They reassigned her to the Outer Grounds full-time after that. Maintenance work, supply inventory, perimeter checks that no one important ever bothered to do themselves. It was the sort of work that made a person invisible, and Lena was already very good at being invisible. She was also, it turned out, very good at the work itself. She reorganized the supply routes, so that deliveries that previously took 3 trips now took 1. She repaired 4 sections of the perimeter fence that had been listed as functional in the maintenance records, and were very clearly not. She noticed that the Northern Supply Outpost had not submitted a report in 11 weeks, not because nothing was happening there, but because someone had quietly stopped requiring the reports, and that someone had done so around the same time that unfamiliar tire tracks had started appearing on the Northern Access Road twice a week. She wrote all of this down in a small notebook. She was not planning to use it. She simply could not help noticing. An old woman named Elder Mira sometimes sat on the low wall near the supply shed in the late afternoons. She was the pack's historian, ancient, wrapped in a wool coat regardless of the weather, with eyes that were sharp in a way that made Lena slightly uncomfortable. Mira never spoke to her. She only watched. And then she would get up and leave, and Lena would go back to her work, and neither of them would mention it. Weeks passed. The pendant continued to be warm in the mornings. Lena continued not to think about it. On the night of the lunar convergence, an event that occurred, according to the pack's calendar, once every generation, Lena lay in her small room and could not sleep because the pendant against her chest was almost too hot to wear. She sat up and held it in both hands and looked at it in the dark. It was a simple piece of copper, roughly circular, about the size of her palm. Her mother had worn it every day for as long as Lena could remember, and when her mother died, she had pressed it into Lena's 7-year-old hands and said, "Keep it close. It is not yet time, but it will be." Lena had assumed, as a 7-year-old would, that her mother was simply being poetic in the way that dying people sometimes are. She looked at the back of the pendant now. There was writing on it, old script, symbols she had seen in history books but never been able to read. She had looked at this writing hundreds of times over 16 years, and it had always been a pattern to her, nothing more than that. She looked at it now, and she could read it. She did not know when this had happened. It had not been possible yesterday. She checked yesterday in her memory carefully, because she was the kind of person who checked things. Yesterday she had looked at the pendant in the morning light and seen shapes. Today she was seeing words. The words said, "She who is chosen does not choose. She who carries the light does not light it. She simply arrives." Lena sat with this for a long time. Then she wrapped the pendant in a cloth, because the heat was becoming genuinely uncomfortable, and the cloth did not help at all, and she did not sleep. Elder Mira came before sunrise. She knocked twice, quietly, and when Lena opened the door, Mira was already stepping inside with the calm authority of someone who had done whatever she liked for so long that it no longer occurred to her to wait for permission. She sat in the single chair at the table. She looked at Lena. "Show me the pendant," she said. Lena showed her the pendant. Mira looked at it for a long time. She turned it over. She read the back, and something in her expression settled, the way an equation settles when the final number falls into place. "Your mother's name was Lena Voss," Mira said. "Before that, her name was Anya Celine Born. She changed it when she came here, because it was safer not to be recognized." She set the pendant down on the table. "This pendant has belonged to the moon-chosen bloodline for 6 generations. The title cannot be given by any alpha. It cannot be inherited in the usual sense. It is confirmed, only confirmed, you understand, not granted, by Celine herself, during a lunar convergence, to the one she has already decided upon long before that night." Lena sat on the edge of her bed. "Your mother carried the potential," Mira continued. "I knew it when I first saw her, 28 years ago, but it passed to you at her death, and it has been waiting for the convergence since." She looked at Lena with those uncomfortably sharp eyes. "I have been watching you for 9 months. I needed to be sure you were what I thought you were." "And?" Lena said. "You reorganized supply routes that 3 different pack managers had failed to fix for 6 years, Mira said. "You repaired infrastructure that was actively recorded as functional in order to cover someone's negligence. You identified a security breach on the northern border that our entire intelligence division missed." She paused. "You are exactly what I thought you were." She stood and walked to the door. "Tonight," she said, "stay outside during the convergence. Whatever happens, do not run from it." She left before Lena could ask a second question. Lena spent the day working, because she did not know what else to do with herself, and because the northern border notes in her notebook had been sitting there for 2 months, and she was tired of carrying them around. She went to the Great Hall at midday. She asked the door guard if she could deliver a report to the Alpha King's office. The guard looked at her the way everyone in this pack had looked at her since spring, and told her she could leave the papers with the administrative clerk. She left the papers with the administrative clerk and walked back to the outer grounds. That evening she ate a small meal, changed into clean clothes, and went outside. The convergence came at midnight. The sky that night was the kind of clear that only happened a few times a year. Not a single cloud, every star visible, the full moon so bright that the ground looked like it was lit from underneath. Lena stood in the open field beyond the supply shed, with her hands at her sides and the pendant resting against her sternum, and she waited. For a while, nothing happened. Then the pendant began to glow. Not the warmth from the past weeks. This was light, actual visible light, the copper turning bright as a coal, illuminating her fingers, and the front of her shirt, and the ground around her feet. She looked at it. She did not run. She remembered Mira's instruction, and she breathed slowly, and she stayed. The light spread. It moved up from the pendant and across her shoulders and down her arms, and it did not hurt. It felt, if anything, like stepping into warm water after a long cold day, like something that had been held tightly for a very long time, finally being allowed to open. The field around her lit up. The light traveled upward, and then it was simply everywhere at once, and then it was concentrated above her head, shaped by something Lena could not see. settling into a form she could only perceive from the expression on the face of the pack member who had stepped outside to check the perimeter and now stood 50 meters away with his hand flat against his mouth. The crown sat above her head and did not fall. It was not gold. It was not any metal she could name. It was made of the same light the pendant had produced, condensed into something that had weight and presence, and that everyone who looked at it seemed to understand, on some level below language, was not decorative. By the time the light faded, there were 30 people standing at the edges of the field. Calum Dre stood at the great hall window on the second floor, alone, and did not move for a long time. By morning, formal acknowledgement had arrived from 3 allied packs. By afternoon, 2 more. The old law, the law that Calum had dismissed in a council meeting 8 months ago as ceremonial and essentially extinct, stated clearly that the Moon Chosen held authority above any Alpha title within the unified pack territories. It was not a law that any living Alpha had ever had reason to take seriously. Calum took it seriously now. The meeting was held in the same great stone hall, 382 people, again, or close enough. Lena stood in the center in clean clothes, and the pendant at her throat was cool now for the first time in months, and above her head, faintly visible even in daylight if you looked at the right angle, the light was still there. Calum came down from the platform this time and stood on the floor, at her level, which told her that he had already made his decision before he walked in. He was a man who understood power, whatever his other failures, and he knew what the morning's messages meant. He stood in front of her. He was taller than her. This had once made her uncomfortable. It did not now. He said, "I called you worthless." She said, "You did." He said, "I was wrong." She said nothing. He lowered himself to one knee. He did it the way he did most things, completely, without hesitation, without leaving himself any room to half commit. Whatever Calum Dre was, he was not a man who did things partially. "I offer my allegiance to the Moon Chosen," he said, in the same carrying voice he had used in spring. Without condition. 382 people heard it. Lena looked at him for a moment. She thought about the walk out of this hall in spring, the pendant warm in her hand, the sound of her boots on the stone. She thought about the 11 weeks of missing reports, and the tire tracks on the northern road, and the supply routes that no one had bothered to fix for 6 years. She thought about her mother pressing a warm piece of copper into the hands of a 7-year-old and saying, "It is not yet time." She placed one hand on Calum's shoulder, not in warmth, not in absolution, in acknowledgement. "Rise," she said. She did not forgive him that day. She accepted his allegiance, and she went back to work, because the northern border situation had not resolved itself and someone needed to follow through on it, and that someone was apparently going to be her. The intelligence division was reorganized within the week. The supply routes she had already fixed, stayed fixed. The perimeter fence held. Calum attended every meeting she called. He implemented every recommendation she made. He did not try to explain himself or to argue, or to ask for things she had not offered. He was, in this period, precisely as useful as she needed him to be, and precisely as quiet as she required, which she suspected cost him more than anyone around him understood. The pendant stayed cool. She still wore it every day. One evening in late autumn, she was at her desk with the notebook open, going over the next month's supply projections, and she became aware that the pendant was warm again. Not the heat of the convergence, nothing like that, just the gentle warmth it had always carried when her mother wore it. She pressed her hand flat against it. Outside the window, the moon was coming up over the eastern tree line, pale and full and patient, the way it always had been, the way it would always be, entirely indifferent to the schedules and rejections and word choices of everyone living beneath it. It had simply waited, the way truth always waits, the way things that are real have no need to argue for themselves. They need only to outlast the certainty of people who have not yet seen them clearly. Lena picked up her pen and went back to work.